Mina, an elite underground fighter, escapes the brutal grip of her promoter, Kang Dae, and seeks anonymity as a graveyard shift cleaner at the Gilded Lily, a high-end Seoul lounge. She hopes her bruised face and silent nature will let her blend into the shadows, but she catches the eye of Junho, the lounge's impeccably groomed owner and a powerful Korean mafia boss, Kung Pei. When Mina's past literally crashes through the front doors, Junho doesn't just protect her, he weaponizes her. Mina must navigate her fear of being owned again while realizing that in Junho's world, her strength isn't a commodity to be sold, but a throne to be shared. The story opens with a visceral, high-stakes breakout. Mina vaulting over a jagged chain-link fence, her white work shirt already torn at the shoulder and stained with the blood of her last opponent. Behind her, the rhythmic, heavy thud of Kang Dae's enforcers' boots echoes through the rain-slicked industrial district, their flashlights cutting through the dark like searchlights. The bell above the door chimed with a lonely, hollow metallic ring as Lena stumbled into the dim warmth of the bar. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, a cold, industrial drizzle that turned the soot on her clothes into a dark, muddy smear. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of her shoes as she moved toward the furthest stool in the corner, her movements stiff and guarded. Every muscle in her body screamed, a chorus of protest from the ribs Victor had bruised and the ankles she had nearly twisted in her flight. She felt like a glass sculpture that had already been shattered, held together only by the sheer force of the wind and the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Behind the polished mahogany of the bar, Marco was moving with the quiet, predatory grace of a man who owned the air he breathed. He was wiping down a glass, his eyes sharp, dark, and impossibly deep, tracking her from the moment she crossed the threshold. He didn't see just another late-night stray. He saw the way she checked the exits before she sat, the way she tucked her chin to hide the darkening bloom on her cheek, and the minute tremor in her hands that she tried to stifle by clenching them into fists. He approached without a word, his presence a heavy, grounding weight in the silence of the room. He didn't ask for her order. Instead, he reached for heavy-bottomed glass and a bottle of single-malt scotch from the top shelf. The liquid amber caught the low light, swirling like molten gold as he poured a generous double. "On the house," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that felt like velvet over jagged edges. He slid the glass toward her but stopped his hand an inch away, never making physical contact. He knew instinctively that a touch would be a threat. Lena finally looked up, her breath hitching. Up close, he was formidable. Expensive watch, a sharp fade, and eyes that had clearly seen the same kind of darkness she was currently running from. I don't have money for this," she whispered, her voice cracking. Marco leaned slightly over the counter, his expression unreadable but his gaze steady. "I'm not asking for money. You look like you've been running for a lifetime, and this bar is the only place in this city where the shadows don't bite back unless I tell them to." He nodded toward the glass. "Drink. Sit as long as you need. No one comes through that door without going through me first." For the first time in years, the frantic drumming in Lena's chest slowed. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold glass, and took a sip. The burn was immediate and clean, a sharp contrast to the dull, aching rot of her life with Victor. She looked at the man behind the bar, realizing she didn't even know his name, yet for some reason, the predatory stillness of him felt more like a shield than a cage. The transition from the gritty, smoke-stained air of the bar to the sterile, mountain-high silence of the penthouse was so jarring it felt like a physical blow. When Lena finally opened her eyes, she wasn't met with the peeling wallpaper of her old bedroom or the terrifying sound of Victor's heavy tread in the hallway. Instead, she found herself submerged in a sea of Egyptian cotton, the sheets so white and cool they felt like fresh snow against her feverish skin. She lay motionless for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was a masterclass in obsidian and glass, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city she had just spent the night fleeing. From this height, the cars looked like harmless embers and the streets like mere cracks in the pavement. It was beautiful, but as Lena pushed herself up, the sharp ache in her side reminded her that the world below was still very real and very dangerous. On the bedside table sat a glass of water and a small, unmarked bottle of high-end painkillers, placed there with a precision that felt both thoughtful and clinical. Next to them was a silk robe, heavy and expensive. Lena reached out to touch the fabric, but pulled her hand back as if it might burn her. In Victor's house, every gift had been a debt. A new dress meant she had to smile more. A piece of jewelry meant she had to stay quiet when his temper flared. Looking around this hyper-modern sanctuary, she couldn't help but wonder what Marco expected in return for this level of luxury. She stood up, her bare feet sinking into a rug so plush it felt like it could swallow her whole. The silence of the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the climate control. There were no locks on the inside of the doors, but as she peered out into the hallway, she saw the subtle glimmer of security cameras nestled in the shadows of the recessed lighting. It was a sanctuary, yes, but it was also a fortress. The floor was too high to jump from, the glass too thick to break, and the man who had brought her here held the only key to the elevator. She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. She was safe from Victor here, hidden away in the clouds by a man who dealt in shadows, but as she watched the sun begin to bleed over the horizon, a cold realization settled in her gut. She had traded a monster for a myth, and while the cage was made of gold and silk, it was a cage nonetheless. She was no longer a victim on the run, but she wasn't yet free. She was a guest of the most dangerous man in the city, waiting to find out if his protection was a gift or a new kind of sentence. The peace of the penthouse was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden sharp vibration of a phone on the marble countertop. Marco didn't rush. He moved with a chilling, practiced stillness that made Lena's blood run cold. He checked the screen, his jaw tightening just a fraction of a millimeter. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice no longer the velvet of the previous night, but a cold blade of steel. "Do not leave this room. Do not answer the door for anyone but me." Downstairs at the Devil's Mark, the atmosphere had curdled. The heavy oak doors had been kicked open, admitting three men who looked like they were carved from the same jagged stone as Victor. They didn't belong in the dim, curated shadows of Marco's domain. They smelled of cheap cigarettes and old aggression. The lead enforcer, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, slammed a photo of Lena onto the mahogany bar. "We know she's here," he spat, his voice echoing in the empty lounge. "Hand her over and maybe we won't have to burn this place to the ground." Descending the spiral staircase, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of the lion on his chest. He didn't look like a man facing a threat. He looked like a predator watching an insect crawl on his dinner plate. "You've made two mistakes," Marco said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stepped behind the bar. "First, you brought Victor's filth into my house. Second, you assumed I negotiate for what is mine." The enforcer reached for the holster at his hip, but Marco was faster, a blur of motion that defied his calm exterior. In one fluid movement, Marco vaulted the bar, his hand catching the man's wrist with a sickening crack before the gun could even clear leather. A second man lunged, but Marco drove an elbow into his throat, the sound of collapsing windpipes filling the sudden silence. The third man froze, his hand trembling as he stared at the two heaps on the floor. Marco didn't even look winded. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes devoid of any heat. "Tell Victor that Lena is under the protection of the Devil's Mark," Marco whispered, leaning in close to the survivor's face. "And tell him that if he sends another soul to my door, I won't just kill them, I'll come for the man who sent them." Upstairs, Lena watched the security feed on a hidden monitor, her breath hitching in her throat. She had seen Victor's violence. It was messy, loud, and cruel. But Marco's violence was different. It was silent, efficient, and absolute. As she watched him calmly wipe a stray drop of blood from his hand with linen napkin, she realized with a shudder of both terror and relief that Victor didn't just have a rival, he had a god of the underworld standing in his way. The heavy silence that followed the violence downstairs was worse than the shouting. Lena stood in the center of the sprawling penthouse, her eyes fixed on the elevator doors. When they finally hissed open, Marco stepped out, looking entirely too composed for a man who had just broken bodies with his bare hands. He was adjusting his cuffs, the lethal grace of his movements now carrying a terrifying weight. Lena realized then that the safety he offered wasn't born of kindness, but of a power so absolute it made Victor look like a common street thug. "You're one of them," she whispered, her voice trembling as she backed away from him. "A boss, the kind people don't talk about." Marco stopped, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity. "I am the man who ensures your husband never touches you again, Lena. That is all you need to concern yourself with." "No," she said, a sudden surge of panic rising in her throat. "I've spent years being protected by a man who treated me like property. I won't do it again. I can't." She lunged for her coat, her movements frantic as she headed for the door. She expected him to stop her, or grab her arm or bar the exit, but he simply stood there, watching her with a chilling, patient detachment. Lena reached the hallway, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. She made it all the way to the elevator, her finger stabbing the call button. But as the doors opened and she stepped inside, the reality of the world outside hit her like a wall of ice. She had no money, no phone that wasn't tracked, and nowhere to run that Victor's reach couldn't touch. The 3 men Marco had just dispatched were proof that her husband's leash was long and his grip was tightening. If she stepped out of this building, she wouldn't even make it 3 blocks before a black sedan pulled up beside her. The elevator doors began to close, but Lena stayed. She looked at the polished silver of the interior, seeing a reflection of a woman who was tired, so deeply tired of being a rabbit in a world of wolves. When the doors hissed shut, she didn't press the button for the lobby. She walked back into the penthouse, her shoulders slumped. Marco hadn't moved. He was pouring a glass of water, his back to her. "The streets are cold today, Lena," he said softly, not turning around. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted, the words tasting like ash. "Then stay," Marco replied, finally turning to face her. His expression wasn't one of triumph, but a somber, dark recognition. "But understand this. In this house, there are rules. And the first rule is that you belong to the sanctuary I provide. You are a prisoner, but you are no longer alone. Choose wisely which danger you prefer." Lena looked out at the city below, realizing she was standing on a precipice. She had escaped the fire, only to find herself standing in the heart of the storm. The following morning, the industrial gray of the city was replaced by the hushed, expensive elegance of a private boutique in the fashion district. The store had been cleared of other patrons before they arrived, the "closed" sign a silent testament to the weight Marco's name carried. He walked through the aisles of silk and cashmere not like a shopper, but like a king surveying a new territory, his presence commanding the undivided attention of 3 nervous-looking attendants. Lena felt like a ghost haunting a palace. She was still wearing the oversized hoodie Marco had lent her, her fingers nervously picking at the frayed hem. When an attendant approached with a measuring tape, Lena instinctively flinched, her shoulders hunching in a reflex born of years of Victor's unpredictable moods. Marco noticed. He didn't say a word, but he stepped into her space, his shadow falling over her like a heavy velvet cloak. He placed a hand on the small of her back, not to push, but to anchor. It was a gesture of absolute possession, a silent signal to the room that she was under the protection of the lion. "Everything," Marco said, his voice a low vibration that cut through the silence. "Shoes, coats, evening wear, nothing she brought with her stays. I want her covered in the best this city has to offer." As the hours passed, Lena was draped in fabrics she didn't know the names of. Each time she stepped out of the dressing room, Marco was there, leaning against a marble pillar, his dark eyes tracing every line of the new silhouette. He wasn't looking for beauty alone, he was looking for the armor she lacked. He picked out a deep charcoal coat with a high collar and a structured black dress that felt like a second skin. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered as they stood before a triptych of mirrors. The woman in the glass looked like a stranger, polished, expensive, and dangerous. Marco stepped up behind her, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection. He reached out, his thumb tracing the fading bruise on her cheekbone. "Victor tried to keep you small by taking everything from you. I will make you so large that he won't be able to see the sun without seeing your shadow." He handed a black titanium card to the manager without looking at the total. As they walked back to the armored SUV, Lena realized that while Victor's ownership was a chain, Marco's was a suit of armor. It was still a weight to carry, a heavy reminder that she was now part of his world, but for the first time, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a prize being polished for a war she was only beginning to understand. The evening was quiet, the penthouse swathed in the bruised purples and deep indigos of twilight. Lena sat on the edge of the leather sofa, the weight of her new, expensive clothes feeling like a heavy costume. Marco stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking out over the flickering lights of the city. For the first time, the predatory stillness about him seemed less like a threat and more like a weary burden. "You look at me and see a man who was born with the world at his feet," he said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the air conditioning. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the glass was sharp, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. "But power like this isn't gifted. It's the scar tissue that grows over a wound that refused to heal." He set his glass down and slowly unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling back the sleeves of his charcoal shirt. On his inner forearm, beneath the expensive watch, was a jagged silver line of a scar that didn't belong to a surgical knife. It was messy, the mark of a betrayal. "My father didn't want a son, he wanted a soldier," Marco continued, his tone devoid of self-pity, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "The man I trusted most, his second in command, was the one who held the blade. He thought killing the heir would be his shortcut to the throne. My father watched it happen. He wanted to see if I was strong enough to survive the strike, or if I was a waste of the family name." Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She looked at the scar, then at the hard line of Marco's jaw. She realized then that they were two sides of the same coin, both of them forged in the fires of someone else's cruelty. Victor had used his hands to break her spirit. Marco's father had used a kingdom to break his heart. "I didn't just survive," Marco said, finally turning to face her. "I took everything from them. But the cost of that victory is that I can never stop being the man with the blade in his hand. I don't know how to exist without a war to fight." He walked toward her, stopping just close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. He didn't reach out, giving her the space she needed to breathe. "So when I see you flinch at a shadow, Lena, I don't see weakness. I see a survivor who hasn't realized the war is over yet." For the first time since she burst through the back door of her old life, Lena didn't look away. The bridge between them was no longer built on his protection or her fear. It was built on the silent, jagged language of their shared scars. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the mark on his arm. In that moment, the Mafia boss and the victim vanished, leaving only two people standing in the wreckage of their pasts, realizing they might be the only ones capable of understanding the depth of the other's darkness. The fragile peace Lena had found in the penthouse shattered during a restless midnight walk. She had been heading toward the kitchen for water, her bare feet silent on the cold marble, when the low, urgent murmur of voices drifted from the study. The door was ajar, a thin sliver of light cutting across the dark hallway. "The location is set, boss," she heard Antonio say, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Victor is biting. He's moved 3 of his best crews toward the industrial docks. He thinks he's found a hole in our security at the penthouse." Lena froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, the silk of her new robe feeling like a shroud. "Good," Marco's voice replied, deep and devoid of the softness he had shown her earlier that evening. "Let him believe he's winning. He won't be able to resist coming for her himself. Once he's out in the open, we end this. We use the girl to pull him into the kill zone, and then we burn whatever is left of his organization." "And if he gets close?" Antonio asked. "The girl could be collateral." "I have it under control," Marco said, though the clinical coldness in his tone suggested a chessmaster moving a pawn, not a man protecting a person. "Victor's obsession is his greatest weakness. We play on that. As long as he thinks he can take her back, he'll walk right into the trap." Lena backed away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The bridge they had built over their shared scars felt like it was crumbling into a chasm. The expensive clothes, the private boutique, the sanctuary in the clouds, it wasn't just protection, it was dressing the bait. She retreated to her room, locking the door and sinking onto the bed. The weight of the golden cage she had sensed upon arrival had suddenly turned into the cold iron of a trap. She realized that in the world of men like Marco and Victor, she wasn't a person, she was a catalyst. Victor wanted her as property, Marco wanted her as a lure. Both of them were using her strength and her trauma as a means to an end. As she watched the security cameras rotate with their mechanical, rhythmic clicks, she felt a familiar, cold hollow opening in her chest. She had escaped a monster only to be adopted by a predator who was far more patient and far more dangerous. She wasn't safe, she was positioned, and as the realization took hold, she knew she couldn't just sit and wait for the trap to spring. She had to find a way to stop being the bait and start being the one who held the line. The confrontation didn't happen in the shadows of the hallway, but in the center of the living room, under the harsh, unapologetic glow of the chandelier. Lena stood her ground as Marco entered, her frame trembling not with the old fear of a victim, but with the cold, sharp fury of someone who had finally realized they were being moved like a piece on a board. "Am I just a lure to you, Marco?" Her voice cut through the silence, brittle and sharp. "Is all of this, the clothes, the sanctuary, the stories about your father, just part of the staging? Did you dress me up just to make sure Victor could see the prize from the street?" Marco stopped in his tracks, his coat half off. The clinical, detached mask he had worn in the study flickered, then shattered. He dropped the coat on a chair and stepped toward her, but the look in Lena's eyes, the look of a woman who felt betrayed, made him hesitate. "You heard the conversation with Antonio," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I heard you calling me a kill zone," she spat, her eyes glistening. "I escaped one man who thought he owned me, only to find another who thinks he can use me as bait. Tell me, Marco, is there any version of my life where I'm just an object for men to fight over?" Marco's composure broke. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. He didn't shake her, but his grip was desperate, anchoring her to the moment. "Yes, it's a strategy. Yes, Victor is coming, and yes, I am prepared to end him when he does. But do not ever think that my feelings for you are part of the game." "How can I believe that?" she whispered, a tear finally escaping. "You're a mafia boss. Everything is a transaction." "Because I could have ended Victor a week ago," Marco roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I could have sent a dozen men to burn his house with him inside. But I didn't. I stayed here. I stayed here to make sure you felt safe first. I wanted you to see that you could have a life that wasn't defined by fear before the war reached the door." He lowered his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. The power imbalance that usually defined them vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged honesty. "I am using the situation to kill him, Lena, that is true, but I am keeping you here because I don't know how to let you go. You aren't the bait. You are the only thing in this city worth fighting for. If he gets within a mile of you, I will burn the world down, but I will not let him touch you. Not because you're mine, but because you deserve to be free of him." Lena looked into his eyes and saw the truth of the scar on his arm reflected in his gaze. He was a man of violence, yes, but for the first time she saw that his violence was a wall he had built around her, not a cage he had trapped her in. The price of trust was high, and the air between them was thick with the coming storm. But as she reached up to steady his hands, she realized she was no longer just waiting for the trap to spring. She was choosing her side. The air in Marco's private office was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and heavy silence. Marco had stepped away to the lower level to finalize the perimeter checks, leaving Lena under the watchful eye of Antonio. For the first time, the penthouse felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Lena paced by the mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the edge of a crystal decanter, when the heavy reinforced doors clicked shut with a sound that was far too final. "Antonio will be back in 10 minutes, Antonio said, but his voice had lost its deferential edge. He wasn't looking at the security monitors, he was looking at his watch. "Something is wrong," Lena whispered, her fighter's instinct prickling at the back of her neck. The silence from the hallway was too absolute. "The feed. Why is the hallway camera dark?" Antonio didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a silenced pistol, laying it calmly on the desk. "Victor offered me something Marco never would," he said, his eyes devoid of the loyalty he had performed for years. "Ownership, not just of a territory, but of the entire southern route. All he wanted in exchange was his property back." The realization hit Lena like a physical blow. The trap Marco had set wasn't failing, it had been dismantled from the inside. Before she could scream, the office windows shattered inward, flashbangs detonated in a blinding white roar, stealing her sight and breath. Through the ringing in her ears, Lena heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots. She lunged for the letter opener on the desk, her muscles coiling to fight, but a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. The scent of stale tobacco and cheap cologne filled her senses, the unmistakable smell of Victor's men. "Don't bruise the merchandise," a familiar, raspy voice commanded through the smoke. Mina struggled, driving her elbow back into a ribcage, hearing the satisfying crack of bone, but a sedative-soaked rag was pressed against her face. As the world began to tilt and fade into gray, she saw Antonio calmly stepping over the glass shards to shake hands with Victor's lead enforcer. "Tell the boss the bait is secured," Antonio murmured. Lena's last sight before the darkness swallowed her was the elevator doors opening. Marco was there, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated carnage as he saw the empty room and the shattered glass. He roared her name, a sound of such visceral pain and fury that it vibrated in her very bones, but the doors hissed shut and the floor began to drop. She was no longer in the sanctuary. She was back in the hands of the monster, and this time the price of her life was the war Marco had tried so desperately to win. The silence that followed the raid was more terrifying than the gunfire. Marco stood in the center of his wrecked office, the smell of ozone and spent powder clinging to his clothes. His eyes weren't filled with rage, they were filled with a cold, flickering void that promised a reckoning the city would not soon forget. He didn't call the police, and he didn't call for a cleanup crew. He picked up his phone and uttered a single sentence that set the underworld ablaze. Level everything associated with the name Victor. Within the hour, the protection Marco had provided Lena transformed into a scorched earth campaign. The tactical restraint he had shown for weeks vanished. Marco moved through the city like a natural disaster, his enforcers systematically dismantling every safe house, warehouse, and front business Victor owned. He didn't just want Lena back, he wanted to erase the very ground Victor stood on. In a dimly lit shipyard on the edge of the district, Marco personally led the charge into Victor's primary distribution hub. He didn't hide behind a desk or bark orders from a distance. He moved through the shipping containers with a suppressed submachine gun, a ghost of vengeance in a charcoal suit. Every man who stood in his way was met with the brutal efficiency Lena had witnessed at the bar, but magnified tenfold. He wasn't looking for survivors, he was looking for a location. He found one of Victor's lieutenants cowering behind a crate of illegal imports. Marco didn't waste time with threats. He stepped on the man's wounded shoulder, the pressure slow and agonizing. "Where is he?" Marco's voice was a low, guttural rasp. "The old estate, the one by the cliffs," the man wheezed, his face pale with terror. "He took her there to teach her a lesson before he leaves the country." Marco didn't blink. He reached down, not to help him up, but to take his phone. He looked at the device, then back at the burning warehouse behind him. He had spent his life building an empire of shadows, but for Lena, he was willing to burn it all down to create enough light to find her. As his black SUV sped toward the cliffs, the city behind him was lit with the orange glow of a dozen fires. Marco checked the action on his pistol, his movements rhythmic and hauntingly calm. He wasn't just a mafia boss anymore. He was a man who had found his heart in a sanctuary and was now prepared to walk through hell to get it back. Victor had made the mistake of thinking Lena was a prize to be stolen, but he was about to learn that she was the only reason Marco hadn't already destroyed everything in his path. The cliffside estate loomed like a tomb against the jagged, moonlit coastline. Inside the grand foyer, the air was thick with the scent of salt water and the metallic tang of blood. Lena sat bound to a heavy wooden chair, her lips split and her ribs aching, but her eyes were fixed on Victor. He paced before her, a glass of brandy in one hand and a cruel, triumphant sneer on his face. He looked diminished, a small man trying to play a god, while the sounds of chaos erupted from the grounds outside. The front doors didn't just open, they disintegrated. A tactical breach charge blew the hinges inward, and Marco stepped through the settling dust before the echo had even died. He wasn't the polished businessman or the patient protector Lena had known. He was a force of nature, his silhouette framed by the flickering firelight of the burning garden outside. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision, dropping Victor's last two guards with shots so fast they sounded like a single heartbeat. "Step away from her, Victor," Marco said, his voice a low, subsonic growl that vibrated in the floorboards. Victor lunged for Lena, pressing a snub-nosed revolver against her temple, his hand shaking with a coward's desperation. "One more step and she's dead. You think you can just take what's mine? She's my wife. She's nothing without me." Lena looked up, not at the gun, but at Marco. She saw the raw, jagged agony in his eyes, the absolute terror of a man who had finally found something he couldn't afford to lose. In that moment, the last fragment of her fear died. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the woman who had survived the fire. As Victor screamed his threats, Lena didn't flinch. Instead, she drove her heel down onto Victor's instep and threw her weight forward, tilting the chair. The distraction lasted only a fraction of a second, but for Marco, a second was an eternity. A single shot rang out, muffled by the roar of the ocean against the cliffs. Victor's eyes went wide, a neat, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. He slumped back, the revolver clattering uselessly to the marble floor as he slid into the shadows of the past. Marco was at her side before Victor's body hit the ground. He didn't look at the dead man. He knelt, his large, blood-stained hands trembling as he sliced through her bindings with a pocket knife. He pulled her into his chest, his face buried in the crook of her neck, his breath coming in ragged, broken hitches. "I have you," he whispered, a prayer and a promise. "I have you." Lena clung to him, her fingers digging into the fabric of his ruined suit. She looked over his shoulder at the man who had haunted her dreams, realizing that Victor looked small in death. The war was over, the monster was gone. And as Marco lifted her into his arms to carry her out of the wreckage, she realized she wasn't just escaping a marriage anymore. She was walking into a new world, carried by the only man who had ever looked at her scars and seen a queen. The heavy, oppressive silence of the cliffside estate was replaced by the soft, rhythmic hum of the city waking up far below. Back in the penthouse, the shattered glass had already been cleared, the air scrubbed of the scent of gunpowder, leaving only the faint, lingering aroma of rain and expensive sandalwood. Lena stood on the wraparound balcony, her hands resting on the cool glass railing. She was draped in one of Marco's heavy silk robes, the fabric a protective weight against the morning chill. The first hints of dawn began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples, deep indigos, and finally, a defiant, glowing gold. The city looked different from this height now. It no longer looked like a labyrinth of hiding places or a map of Victor's territories. It looked like a kingdom, and for the first time, Lena didn't feel like a trespasser in it. The glass door slid open behind her with a whisper. Marco stepped out, his movements tired but no longer frantic. He didn't say anything as he came to stand beside her. He simply leaned against the railing, his dark eyes watching the sun climb over the steel and glass skeletons of the skyline. The lion of the city looked human in the early light, the bruises on his knuckles the only remaining testament to the hell he had unleashed to bring her home. "You're quiet," he said softly, his voice a low vibration in the morning air. "I was thinking about the first night I walked into your bar," Lena replied, turning to look at him. "I thought I was running into another cage. I thought your protection was just a different way of being owned." Marco reached out, his hand hovering for a second before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was steady, devoid of the desperate possession of the night before. "And now?" "Now I know that a cage is where you are kept," she said, leaning into his hand, "but a sanctuary is where you are chosen. You didn't just save my life, Marco. You gave me a world where I'm allowed to have one." She looked out at the sunrise, realizing that the fear that had been her constant companion for years had finally evaporated, replaced by a fierce, quiet resolve. Marco's world was violent, dark, and complicated, but it was a world where she stood as an equal, not a shadow. She wasn't just his property to be guarded. She was the heart of the fortress he had built, Marco pulled her into the crook of his arm, and she didn't flinch. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the light flood the streets below. The dawn didn't just signal the end of the night, it signaled the end of her life as a victim. As the sun fully broke over the horizon, illuminating them both in a harsh, beautiful clarity, Lena finally closed her eyes and let the past go. She wasn't running anymore. She was home.